Thanks for coming. This is the open question. It's really the second in a two-part series, which may be a three-part series, which may be a four-part series. The first time we did this was last year. We had the same distinguished panelists. The format's going to be pretty open, as you'd expect from the open question. Really, no topic is off limits. Open can be defined any way you want. I'll introduce the guests. Everyone will give you their opinion on what open should be defined as. And after that, we're going to be open to questions all the way along. So you should be preparing your good questions. Come speak at the microphone. This event's being webcast live. It will also be rebroadcast on demand. It'll be replayed around the world at MIX events in the coming years. So the questions you ask will help challenge the speakers and enlighten people, probably numbering in the tens of thousands. So invite your good, thoughtful questions. Your bad, unthoughtful questions, just leave them at home. No need for those here. All right, so let me, without further ado, introduce the panel briefly. From left to right, we've got Miguel de Icaza from Novell, or arguably Zimian, or arguably Mexico City. He is the inventor of Mono, among other things. Next to him, we have Andy Gutmans of Zend fame. Andy is the co-inventor of PHP and is the CTO and co-founder of Zend Technologies, which is the PHP company. Then we've got Rob Connery, a recent assimilation by the Borg. Rob Connery was on this panel last year, and he was the lead architect and developer for Subsonic.net, which is one of the top open source .NET data frameworks in the world. He now works as a developer working on Microsoft's MVC framework in the agility team at Microsoft, led by Sean Burke. And then finally, we have Mike Schrepfer, who's the vice president of engineering at Mozilla Corp, responsible for herding the thousands of worldwide cats that contribute to Firefox and Thunderbird. So without further ado, each panelist will introduce himself and give you their definition of open. And we'll start with Mike, because you had to wait longest to be introduced.
So I'll keep the intro short, because I'm actually really curious about people's questions on this, since this is an open panel. But I think for me personally, and maybe a little bit for Mozilla, openness is a means to accomplish many good things in the market. And I think that when you talk about open, you have to be careful about what you're talking about. There's open in terms of source code. There's open in terms of process, so watching what people do and looking at bugs. And then there's open in terms of interop and standards. And I'm stealing, Sam said most of this in the intro, so before we met, so I'm stealing many of that. But I think all three of these things are important in terms of how you build great products, how you make sure you understand what people really want in the market. And if you're not open and transparent about what you're doing, then people don't have an opportunity to comment and say what they want before you've actually shipped products. And so I think that for us it's a philosophy on building great products, great process, products that are secure and easy to use, and doing so in a way that takes into account developer, user, and worldwide kind of opinions on how this thing should be built and how it should be run. And I think for me personally, that's one of the big things that are important about open is what does it get you and why is it important?
Thanks, Mike.
What he said. Still all my buzzwords.
Rob says +1.
Right, exactly. Pretty much the same thing. Openness, for me, is about transparency, and that's probably the core. It's something I'm trying to bring to Microsoft. And when I was hired, the idea was that my skills with the community and just laying it out there completely 100% honestly kind of made a nice fit for what we're trying to do with MVC and other things, the kind of the changing of the guard, so to speak, that a lot of people like to talk about. And it's a challenge, and I like it. And it's, to me, it's all about just laying it right out there, right up front, taking in the contributions, taking in the ideas, taking in, and then churning right back out saying, here you go. But I agree 100% with what Mike said for now.
Yes, I think, same for me. I think there are a couple of things I want to add to that. So first of all, when it comes to interoperability, I think what's really important about being open is to enable other people who want to build and connect to your systems to open your protocols, open your file formats, and enable that ecosystem to build around you. And that's one of the things I think that Microsoft has done in the past few weeks, where they've announced that they're going to open up a lot of those interoperability specifications. I think the second piece to that is, okay, how do you then make sure that you message correctly, whether you are or not allowed to, to interoperate and under what terms. And I think that's something that Microsoft still has to work on. So I think it's really two things. First of all, it's actually making that decision to be open and open up. And then the second thing is, how do you articulate that? How do you message it so that you don't, create confusion among your community? And then I think the second thing around open is, I think Zend, although we, contribute a lot to open source companies, we also have proprietary software. And I don't think open is around, open source versus proprietary. What I do think it is about, though, is about, creating a level playing field. So in an open market, you do want to make sure that there's a level playing field, especially around the kind of the real bottom of the infrastructure, so that a lot of the vendors can then, compete and build their solutions in that space. So it's those two things.
Thanks, Andy. Miguel?
Well, it's just, you can talk about this stuff for hours, but I guess everything that you said is very interesting. I guess what is interesting to me about open, and in particular open development and open protocols, is what happens now with the internet, where you've been able to get people with similar interests connected, people that might not have met otherwise. What open allows is that someone in Mexico can meet up with someone in Boston, and by sharing a common interest, we can say, hey, we can build this thing together. And if this was a closed system, and I would say that the pre-internet days very much amounted to a closed system, because there's very little interaction beyond you could do in those days.
Of course, at that time in the 80s, they were starting to call them open systems, even though for current standards,
they were really closed. I'm not
that
that interested about those particular ones, but what I think that is fascinating is the fact that you can get people that otherwise would have never met. So you can get 5 or 10 people that actually care deeply about a subject, get together and build something fantastic. And as long as you put artificial barriers, and those are, the same way that we talk about trade barriers, as soon as you put artificial barriers, you're basically protecting a particular kind of product or project for no good reason other than protecting it, rather than hello? Am I still? All right. So, so for example, there's this company that we've been working with based in Denmark, and these people met on the internet, and there are a dozen of people. One comes from Norway, one comes from Iceland, another comes from Germany, a couple more are Danish, and they had a common interest for a particular project, and they got together and built a fantastic product. And so to me, what matters about being open is you can lower these barriers for innovating. You can lower the barriers for creating something new or solving a new problem in an interesting way. And in the process, we're all human, and we all want to have fun, and we want to create something interesting and make kind of an impression in the world. So that's, to me, what's important. And then there's a lot of pieces that you can talk about, like whether it has to be open source, it has to be an open standard where you can interoperate. And those are all very valid questions. But in the end, I think that it's about empowering the individual.
Thank you. I probably should have introduced myself. I am the Director of Open Source and Linux Strategy at Microsoft. Taking the open question to to an ontological layer, not a hierarchical one. I often see there's open source, open specifications, open standards, and open process, and all of those mix to be able to enable the kinds of interactions that were raised on the panel. Obviously, we did announce the interoperability commitment that the company has made, and opening specifications to all the formats, protocols, and APIs in Office, SharePoint, Windows Server, Windows Vista, the .NET Framework, and SQL Server. So I think in the years since the last panel, I think we've made a number of achievements in working better with Firefox, working better with PHP, working with the Mono team on Moonlight development. We began to work with Eclipse. We began to work with the Apache Software Foundation. So piece by piece, I think we're transitioning to support open development in a way that we weren't able to commit to or to execute on a year ago. So with that, I'll invite the audience to come up and ask questions. And until somebody stands up, we're just going to debate what the most important part of the open ontology is. Oh, it looks like we've got a question already.
Steven,
Is the microphone on up front? We're not hearing it in the monitor.
Is it on? Okay.
It's great.
This is Steven from CBT Nuggets. I have a question for Miguel. Something we're doing, of course, is we're developing with Mono and Moonlight. So there's this new agreement, I guess, new openness between for developing, where you're actually getting help from Microsoft for doing Moonlight development. And so I was wondering if you can articulate what that actually means, and also if that kind of carries across to Mono also.
Right. So the particular agreement with Moonlight is very simple. We get access to the regression test suites from Microsoft, which means that we get, rendering issues, access to what it should be in JavaScript, how it should respond to, how it should be rendered, what the fonts should look like, what gradients are. I mean, the stuff that you would typically get from the specifications, but the tests in the end are, specifications sometimes do not really tell the whole story. So we did get the specifications. We have access to the technical people inside Microsoft to answer any questions that we might have about Silverlight. And we got access to all of the regression test suites. I don't remember how many test suites we got. There's a lot. What I know is that right now we're down to 28 failures. That was on Monday, and hopefully today we are down to less failures than that. But we should be, we're basically on track to do that. Now, as it relates to Mono, as you know, Silverlight 1.0 is just video, audio, and kind of a powerful canvas that plugs into the web, right? And we're bringing that to Linux or to any other operating system that Microsoft chooses not to support. Our stuff is open source. You can put it on, if you want to put it in your watch, you can put it in your watch. And but 2.0 is really what got us excited. In fact, I could care less about 1.0. It just happens that if you do 2.0, you get 1.0 for free. And 2.0 is really what got us excited, which is the Mono virtual machine, is the .NET class libraries, is integration with Link, is web services, is sockets, it's any programming language that you want. I personally like C# and Boo. Those are my favorite languages, but some people like JavaScript, so go ahead and build with JavaScript. But so when it comes to Moonlight, we're also receiving help from Microsoft for making sure that basically the 2.0 stack, which is a lot more complicated than 1.0, passes every test, that it's secure, that if you write an application for Windows, it will run on Linux. And we're achieving that through getting access to the Microsoft test suites, which are a lot bigger than these test suites. Now, the good news is that we're big fans of testing everything we do. So Mono today has something like 70,000 individual test suites that we run every time that we do a check-in. So every time we do a check-in, it runs against the Microsoft.NET, and we make sure that the tests pass on .NET and that the tests pass on Mono.
You probably also want to mention the codecs.
Oh yeah, the codecs. And the other thing that Microsoft is providing is the media space is kind of a very complicated space because there's a lot of companies that own patents and license those technologies. So MP3, VC1, WM, and so on. So there's a lot of patents involved in this thing, and you basically have to pay a fee for each one of those. And the problem that we were facing was, we can certainly produce Moonlight, but what are we going to do about the codecs, right? In open source, you can certainly get, copies from some site in Romania, but, that's not really an answer you can tell your customers. Yeah, you just go to this website in Romania or, in this special island that doesn't have trade restrictions, and you'll get your codecs. So what Microsoft agreed to do, and thank you so much for the question, that's beautiful. So what Microsoft agreed to do is they will provide the codecs to every Linux user. So they're the ones that actually have to deal with all that stuff, and all we have to do is plug their codecs, and we can have a fully, license and you're not going to be in any kind of legal trouble for doing that. So Microsoft is doing that for us, which we couldn't have done otherwise.
And let me illustrate a little bit on the patents on the codecs. So the Motion Picture and Television Engineering Association owns the patents for VC1, which is the key codec that you'll see for the kind of high definition streaming of video that you get through Silverlight. So those are the types of agreements and relationships that Microsoft has had to negotiate to ship our software for many, many years. And we pay volume licensing for that intellectual property. I think we paid well over $1 billion to license that intellectual property from the owners.
So Miguel, on the patent question, if I distribute Moonlight independently, so if I'm not Novell, do I get the same patent protections for both Silverlight and the codecs?
Well, the codecs you have to obtain from Microsoft. And the patent, there is a patent covenant that Microsoft has granted any person that downloads a codec from Novell to use it. As to extending that patent covenant to third parties, I think you have to talk to Microsoft. The terms of the agreement are public and they're on the web, and I wish they were different and I wish anybody could get them, but that is not the case.
Yeah, so I think this is an important point because it's one of the challenges when you talk about open, because there are products that are open source but are patent encumbered. And so that means that I can get the source and theoretically distribute it, but now I'm at legal risk from patent holders to those things. And in Novell's case with Silverlight, you have a covenant with Microsoft, so Novell is protected, but that protection doesn't extend to any third-party distributor of open. So, and that's not a criticism.
Novell customers are protected. Novell, anyone that downloads Moonlight from Novell is protected. In the same way that when you download Flash from a website, you're covered. But yeah,
I think it's it's beyond I think anyone's here control to fix all of these problems. But there are a lot of complicated IP patent licensing restrictions in the world that can still, even when you have open source, can still end up not getting you the end result you're interested in, which is free and open distribution from a variety.
Yeah, but for example, let me
vendors.
ask this question. I mean, now that you've chosen to bring this issue, does Mozilla give an indemnification to anyone for the patents that Mozilla might be using? And I think that you guys get a free ride because, I mean, you're never going to be sued by Microsoft due to the history of the web. So you're not going to be sued, but there's code in Mozilla that I'm sure infringes on third-party patents. So what kind of guarantees does Mozilla give beyond that? So I think that what we're doing with Microsoft at least is saying, at least for anything that Microsoft owns, and you can't say anything about the third parties, right? You can't say anything about a patent troll or a third-party company, IBM or Sun or anyone that might have patents. You can't really make a commitment about any of that stuff, and you're still at risk. But at least we said, listen, this is Microsoft technology. Let's eliminate the question about patents in this particular scenario. And I think that's much better than saying, well, we might be infringing, but we're going to stick it to the man and just not say anything about that. So I appreciate your concern, but I think that we've done as well as we could given the circumstances.
Again, this isn't a criticism of you. I'm just saying it's a challenge of the system in general in terms of being clear about what's open and not. And to answer your question, we don't hold any patents, so we don't have any form of indemnification from anyone. So in that sense, we are as protected or unprotected as anyone else who distributes a derivative of Firefox. So I'd say that it's a fairly equal scenario in which we're no more or less protected than average Joe who does it, which isn't true with you and Moonlight, right? In which there are known patents there that you have an explicit covenant for.
So there's a distinction here, which I think is important. I think it wasn't totally captured in how Miguel introduced it, which is that if you download Moonlight from Novell, you don't need to make any kind of payment. There's no transaction going on. You're protected. So it's a free download from Novell. The framework we're able to work out. It's distinct from the license agreement that we have with Novell more broadly in our collaboration with Novell on SUSE Linux, Zen, WS Management, WS Federation.
But I think that it's unfair that you keep painting Novell as the only one that is protected because, if IBM redistributes Firefox, they're on much better conditions than you guys are because, if somebody tries to sue IBM, it's like, well, good luck with that, first of all. But the same thing happens with Sun. I mean, Sun has a cross-patent license agreement with Microsoft, right? So if you're going to put us in the same box about, you guys have special treatment, a lot of people have done cross-patent license agreements in this industry, Oracle, SAP, all of these people. So I'm not happy about the fact that such an agreement was made. I think that we should have stayed with the open source community. It's above my pay grade to make that kind of decisions about the patent situation. In my opinion, and I think that Andy brought this up previously, I think that it's good that Microsoft is opening up the protocols, but I think that in this world where Microsoft makes most of its revenue from copyright shipments and revenue from copyright shipments, and we're moving into a world where advertising and online presence and communities is going to bring the majority of the revenue. Really, the patent piece or licensing patents is such a tiny piece And Microsoft is getting for good reason a lot of heat from people that say, why are you trying to monetize this tiny piece where you have this huge one, which is Office and Microsoft, and there's this future of advertising and online services, which is bigger, and you're basically shooting yourself in the foot through this particular tiny bit. And in fact, I don't think that Linux or Windows are relevant in the long term. And if I was Microsoft, I wouldn't be concerned about that. I think that Google has shown that those might be fantastic products. They may be great cash cows, but there's a future beyond just selling copyrights and selling patents, and it's going to be owning and delivering content to end users. So I'm with you, man. And again, it was beyond my paycheck, but I think that Microsoft is making a mistake by trying to make money on this tiny piece where there's a huge pie over there, and it's hurting everyone.
So we have another question, but let me
anyways.
just sort of complete that discussion by saying one of the long-standing tensions in open source development is between the existence of source code, the existence of patents, and how does that get settled. When you look at large commercial organizations like IBM, like Sun, like Microsoft, there becomes a question of U.S. business law and how do you follow the law of the land and the practices around intellectual property, and how does that distinguish from the practices within the open source community. I'll point out that Microsoft is a supporter of the Patent Reform Act of 2007. So over time, the way that this should be resolved is it should move from the sphere of practice in open source to being a legislated issue like the rest of U.S. business law is. And that's the general arc that we see this whole path following. Next question.
Thanks. So you guys talked about a variety of types of being open in terms of code and standards and so forth, but I think another one that's increasingly important is open data, open access for users to be able to get their data and mash it up with the different services they use. And you see a little of that in the sort of pre-web era of like, does Microsoft Outlook have an export feature or not? But on the web, it's a lot less clear about, if I've got data stored in Hotmail or any of these other services, what rights do or should I have to move that around? And especially in social services, it gets even more complicated where there's multiple people's data. So I was just wondering if you guys could all sort of comment on what you think about that whole space, because it seems like, and in the going forward, you don't just need the code, you need the code and the data, and they're equally important.
Data portability is tremendously important, and I think it's the 90% of the iceberg under the water right now when you look at where the web is going. But let me pass it to the most interested parties here. So
I think that's a really excellent question, and I think it's going to be one of the emerging challenges for the future. And I think you kind of have to ask, what are the structural motivations to cause people to want to protect things, right? And I think historically, software made money through IP, right, by selling you software, which is ultimately code and some forms of patents. And I think that model is slowly changing over time. Obviously, there are plenty of people who make money by selling IP, and so that's their structural encouragement to protect that in any way possible, right? And I think you're starting to see that with data too. People are realizing on the net that data is very valuable, right? And it is it's a barrier for switching costs. So it's hard for me to move to social network B if social network A has my entire friends list and a bunch of blogs and a bunch of other stuff. Like, it's just harder for me to move, even if site B is better than site A. So I think, and there's like all complicated problems like patents and other things. There's no easy one-trick, answer to that. I'd say it all starts with consumer and market awareness, right? At the end of the day, it starts with people demanding what's important to them. And I don't mean legislation. I just mean as a user of products and saying, it's really important that the data I created, I can in some form pull back out and do something else with. And that is something I'm going to look for in products that I use. And that's the quickest, easiest way to reform the market, is to let people know that that's what people are looking for, in their product. Transparent process, transparent data, transparent code, and a competitive marketplace where the best product wins, without any of these artificial barriers to entry or competition.
I think in many cases it's just going to happen because the market forces are going to, create the mashups. The value is going to come from mashups. So I think any vendor that doesn't open up the data, someone's data, and there's things like Open Social, of course, that are also kind of going in that direction. I think those vendors are going to lose, in the long run. So I think the market's really going to force all the vendors to make that data accessible.
The other thing close to open data is open identity, right? Because you need to be able to have consistency and control over user identity in order to access all of that data. So the federation and resulting integration or data portability is going to be a key challenge. And there are emerging standards. There's a an identity meta system. You can see it in OpenID, you can see it in card space, but I think it's very closely correlated.
Well, it's also interesting too because you see efforts like this with Passport, and things that have flopped because people say, "Oh, I don't want to shove all my data in this one silo." Mm-hmm. And so, as much as a company might try and move that direction, sometimes people are just really resistant to having their information that transportable. They want to hold it close to their chest. So, you can't ignore that part either. So, I don't think the answer is completely in the market. It's also psychology. So, there's that.
Just on that point, I'm one of the co-founders of Data Portability. Passport is a very different model to what OpenID is. So Passport was, one vendor owning and charging for a certain authentication model, whereas OpenID anyone can implement. And also the data portability model that's emerging in the discussions in the project and is not about moving all your data to one silo. It's about creating like a catalog of services you use and then providing pointers to data. So it's not about any single silo owning or moving all that data around. So it's a very different model in a very different marketplace right now.
Right, which again goes back to the point that I made about the identity meta system. Right, so Passport is a relic and no longer a technology that's used. Right, you look at the new approach like card space, entirely standards based, connected to projects like Higgins project from the Eclipse Foundation. Ongoing interoperability between OpenID. There needs to be a robust but multi-vendor, multi-technology identity meta system in order for everybody to have the choice, the flexibility, and fundamentally, going back to the topic of the panel, the openness that people are demanding.
Let me add just one last thing because I think that at the end, what happened with proprietary software and with licensed software is basically that you had, I think that it was Phil that told me that last night, but you basically had you basically have a license to print money, right? And, you press a button, $700 come on the other side. You want a copy, you press a button, $700 come on the other side, right? And if you look at every, business plan that is being pitched on right now about the Web 2.0 company to a VC, it's all about bringing as many users and keeping as many users as you can. So the challenge that people that are trying to get open data out is that there is this huge inertia. Basically, the world is moving from we had a proprietary advantage through proprietary formats and proprietary operating systems and proprietary applications, and we're moving to we're going to own as many people as we can. So the challenge of any framework for open data is going to be the same challenge that open source had against proprietary systems, which is it's in nobody's interest for those that are pressing buttons and getting money on the other end to make sure that information gets out. Right, so Blizzard is not going to get you all the data from their servers so you can migrate to another gaming system, for example, right?
There are business models emerging and being discussed right now, which makes the business case for why it is in people's best interest. So those answers are being worked out right now, and obviously the vendors are very interested in working that out, of course. But because the economic engine at the moment is advertising, then the more data you have about a user, the better advertising you can do, the better targeting you can do, and also the better personal content experience you can do. So if you can create network effects across the web instead of network effects just in a silo, it's in the vendor's best interest to do that. So if I, as a user, come to a new site and bring all my data with me, that's an advantage for the vendor. And also, if you're Amazon.com, you know tons about the books I buy, but you don't know anything about the searches I make. Right. So, and Google has the inverse problem. So, if they are sharing data, they have a much richer picture of the user's interests and tastes. So, there are business models involved, but no one owns the user. That's a fallacy.
Tim O'Reilly talks extensively about this issue that we're moving to a place where the value's in the data, and people are going to be as protective as that data. If that's your source of revenue, you're going to protect that as much as you can.
Well, let me, if I can, let me ask you a question, and I'm going to stick my foot in my mouth, but it's what I do. So let me ask you a question. Do you have the Google toolbar?
No.
Okay. Well, so some browsers out there, toolbars, whatever, will store your personal information, including a credit card. Does anybody here ever use that?
Yes.
To fill in forms. Seriously, does anybody use it? Okay, well, great.
So like 3 people, just for those watching, about 3 people out of maybe 100 raised their hands.
I think you hit the nail on the head in a business sense as to why this is important. And that's an economic business, makes great sense. In terms of personal use, for me, I don't put my information anywhere. I don't want spam. I don't want ads following me around. I don't want those things. And that's just me, right? I think that the fundamental issue of what we're talking about in terms of data operability and so on isn't necessarily a market-based force. I think people are very into holding their information right here. And a lot of people don't, like OpenID is a great thing, and we all agree on that. But at the same time, if I sign in somewhere and I cause trouble in a forum, I want to be able to leave that forum and never oh no, it's not me. You know what I'm saying? Right. So I think there's a thing there. That's all I'm saying.
I don't want to monopolize the questions,
okay.
But you will anyway.
Well, I'll just answer the question.
Sure. Let's see if there's another question first before we continue this conversation. Any others?
I'd like to hear your comments on the Yahoo acquisition.
Can you direct the question specifically? Is it to the whole panel, or is it to anyone?
Yeah, well, I mean, whoever kind of wants to step up. Probably, I mean, you'd be an ideal candidate working for Microsoft. Is the Yahoo deal kind of I find it hard to believe that it's just about becoming number 2 in search, number 1 in IM, number X in email. And I hope it's kind of a opportunity for Microsoft to remedy some open source, continue the steam, maybe take it up to another order of magnitude. So is the Yahoo deal, especially kind of talking to people coming from a developer background, a kind of a retrovirus, hopefully making Microsoft a more open company?
The acquisition is being run by the online services business, so it's not something that I have the authority or the information to comment on. But if you want my personal perspective, you can read my blog on Port 25. It's called "Why I'm Excited About Yahoo." I think there are opportunities to take the insights of people like Rasmus Leerdorf, old colleague of Andy's, Doug Cutting. You look at technologies like Hadoop. You look at thousands of PHP developers and a strong open source culture. Personally, as the open source guy, in the Microsoft sort of ranks, it's tremendously exciting to me. I guess I'll pass that on to the rest.
Sounds like a radioactive topic. I mean, it sounds like we can go on and on and on. But anyways, I didn't want to ruin. I didn't want to. Maybe you guys want to really share.
My personal opinion, I think it's great. I mean, I've used Yahoo's Mail. I've used Yahoo for lots of things. And my personal opinion is that company's in a downward spiral. Nose first, going to explode. And they have so many assets out there. They've done so many things so well. They've sort of bled out, fragmented, and just dying a little death because of their culture. I don't know what their corporate culture is about, but I think that's one thing that Microsoft does have. And again, my personal opinion, is a really strong culture for enabling. And I think there's synthesis there. I think it's a good thing. So.
I mean, I come at it from the PHP angle, of course, and Yahoo is pretty much 100% PHP. I think for me it's very interesting because it's really going to force a lot of PHP into Microsoft. When Microsoft did the Hotmail acquisition, I think it was in the 90s, that was kind of one application. I think over a period of 5-6 years, they managed to migrate most of that onto Windows and I think onto ASP. With the size of Yahoo and the amount of applications they have, I don't think that would happen. So I think it would also force, an increasing amount of openness throughout Microsoft. And I think, it'd definitely be another accelerator for this kind of open culture inside of Microsoft.
We've already done a lot of work with the PHP community to improve the performance, reliability, and over time the manageability, identity access of PHP running on top of Windows and running on top of IIS. So we've got major achievements that we announced in the launch of Windows Server 2008 last week, and we'll continue to. So
you'll probably see PHP on Server 2008.
Will certainly make my job more interesting.
Right, PHP on Server 2008.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question more towards Sam, specifically around the impact of an open source strategy on the developer mindset in a closed source company, traditionally closed source company. So the idea of opening up your source can probably be intimidating for corporate developers who maybe have been able to take advantage of kind of owning a piece of code or a piece of a module, and then turning that into a publicly consumable or publicly accessible component or unit test could be intimidating. Have you experienced any of that, or how would you address some of those challenges? It's certainly a compelling model. A large company might say, oh, I'd love to kind of introduce an open source philosophy. All my source trees will be accessible. Any developer can contribute to anybody else's project. But practically speaking, the community aspect of it is largely driven by assembling people who have a similar passion for the code. But in a corporate environment, there may equally be a passion for making a living and doing something else with the.
So there's a few different topics you touched on. I think I'll take three of them. The first is generational change. Tony, I'm going to blank on his name for a moment. The always-on guy. Anyway, there's some pretty good insights from a gentleman who analyzes media, and he said basically there are people who use phones, people who use email, and people who use IM, and they fall into generally three distinct age categories. His words, not mine. If you're under 30, you're probably using text to communicate rather than email. Similarly, as we look at developers that we've hired in to the company with computer science backgrounds, degrees in the last 5 years, I'll guarantee you they've all used or seen open source. So there's an underlying wave of developers are comfortable, right? You look at technology adoption that way. Second is there are already hundreds of open source projects being run by Microsoft engineers, both on Codeplex and on SourceForge. So I think the company at this point in time has become increasingly comfortable with the idea of what we do there. And finally, the most important thing to me is that Microsoft's business was built out of open APIs, right? Anybody here is a developer? Microsoft in the 90s was the easiest platform to program to. You understood the error messages. You understood all the documentation. You've got thousands of disks that came to you every year, and you had all the MSDN information that you needed. So what's happened in the last decade, sort of the open source decade, is that the bar has been raised beyond open APIs to saying, and that SDK that you gave me, I'd like to see the source for that, right? I want to be able to extend that and modify that. That sample code, can I turn that sample code into something that's richer and that's living, that's being improved? So we look at things like the .NET Nuke, which started out as a set of sample code provided by the ASP.NET team, became a thriving open source project, probably one of the most commonly downloaded .NET-based open source projects around. So there's a few different key points that I wanted to make sure that you understood. This has been an evolutionary process over some time, both in the industry, and then that, of course, is reflected by Microsoft, because we are a microcosm of the industry.
Well, this is for the whole forum. Do you envision the web being open source in the future? Meaning, the focus on the web is mostly, or will be mostly in the content. But only a handful of sites provide the source code for their own functionality, especially on the server-side code. So do you think that, that the web will ever be open, that the sites will provide their code and people will be able to contribute or see that code?
I can take that as a server-side guy. I hope that doesn't happen. I think, getting access to server code is pretty dangerous from a security point of view. So I think again, it's when it comes to the web, it's more about open APIs, being able to get at your data, being able to access web services. I think when you look at the server side, you don't want to see the passwords that you use to connect to the database. You don't want to be able to, have an easier time finding XSS attacks and all the security attacks on the server. So I think it's definitely good for kind of the servers to be behind a firewall. What I would like to see is companies like Google who are leveraging open source on the web and are modifying open source, make sure that those companies contribute back to open source. So I don't know how much you follow Google and the changes they made to MySQL. It took a very long time for them to actually be willing to contribute that back. So I think open sourcing their application isn't that important. But what is important is when they leverage open source. Facebook is an example. They're running PHP. They've contributed back to the PHP community, and that is exactly what you want to see. You want to see the companies leveraging open source, giving back.
Well, let's say, any security or any connections on the server side are not provided, but in a way, all those arguments were also the same arguments. We heard from on the desktop side of opening the source code. People will be able to probe for attacks or know how the software works. Might be able to well, try and do something malicious.
Yeah, I think that it's not very well known, but Mozilla actually runs a large number of web properties, mostly built on PHP. The add-on side, our update servers, bug systems, all of that, and all of the source code for all of those server apps are checked in to our source control system and are open for participation in development. So, so I think it's a specific, and I'm talking about sites that are running tens of millions of hits a day, with data centers across 3 continents. So these aren't little toy Mickey Mouse apps. These are big, heavily used apps. And I think you hit a really good point on the security thing. Is that we've heard the security through obscurity argument before, and I think in the security circles that argument is pretty much not accepted. Right? Is that the best way to get a secure product is to get as many people as possible looking at it at once to identify what the issues are, so that you identify the issues before someone who wants to monetize it through organized crime, for example, which happens every day, exploits that vulnerability in order to do it. So I think that getting things out and public and visible with more eyes on it is a great way to ensure that that your products are secure. I think, and it gets back a little bit to the very beginning part of this conversation, is one of the hardest things that people don't realize, it's not just about showing your source code. It's realizing that it's like living in a glass house, right? Everyone can see what you're doing. They can see your source code. And it's very unnerving. It takes a lot of courage for people to do that because it's easier to hide things behind a closed door. So I think you've got to get over that hump of fear, basically, to do that and realize that there's challenges and it's hard and people will criticize what you do. But the net result is you're getting more feedback sooner about what you're doing, your process, your code, and hopefully that is incorporated into a product and a technology which is both better and more secure. So I think, you raised a really good point, which is there are not a lot of end-to-end web properties. There's web infrastructure like PHP, which is open source, but it's, go and Google around the net for an entire end-to-end application, server-side application that's open source.
Well, Drupal and all the content management systems, the commerce systems, there are a huge amount of open source applications. What I meant was if it's a Salesforce.com that's running your CRM. Yeah. I do think that to a certain point, security by obscurity, it does work to a certain extent. So I'm not sure. We're a Salesforce user. I'm not sure I feel too happy if they throw all their Java code into the open.
So clearly, if you publish your passwords, right, then that's kind of dumb. But that's the one place where secrets actually help. But I think we'll just agree to disagree. Yeah. That I think there are different opinions on this, and in terms of what's the best way to get security in these products.
Thank you for your question.
Oh, and last follow.
Well, let's see if anybody has any questions first. No? Crickets? Okay. Go ahead.
Well, in opening the source code for a website, do you think that could actually decrease, phishing attacks or any sort of dubious handling of the user information as well?
Well, I think you know what my answer to that's going to be, which is that I think in general, having more people look at the source code is a way to bulletproof that source code. And so I would hope that, just like in client-side products, server-side products that are open, finds those vulnerabilities sooner. And it's not just other people, right? There are tools out there. If you go to universities and look at who's doing the latest research in security, right, PhD students, the first 2 things they run anything new they're trying out on, it's the Linux kernel and Mozilla, right? Because if their product can identify a bug or vulnerability or problem in those 2 pieces of source code, they've got something that's interesting because those are 2 big existing useful pieces of source code. So I think that's a specific example of how you're going to get much faster forewarning of issues, and they'll often work with us or work with Linux in order to get those things fixed in the products before someone else figures that out, through reverse engineering. And I think if you actually look at the number of attacks that actually happen in the real world, the vast majority of them are reversed engineered from behavior. They're not actually done from source code, right? Because people look at things, they kind of pick the lock from the outside instead of looking at the gears themselves. So again, I think it's personal opinion, obviously, and opinion of Mozilla, but I think for us at least, openness has resulted in dramatically better security. Once you get over that initial hump. Obviously, if you just take your source code and publish it out on the net without any review, that's going to be problematic because you'll miss a password or you'll have a vulnerability that you spot. But if you do it in a contained way and then get into an open, transparent process, I think you can be safer.
I think again, my personal opinion, I think you have the luxury of being Mozilla, too, because you're loved by everybody, just about. And if you're Microsoft and you throw your source to Vista out there, oh, I mean, come on, we got to be fair about that. You throw the source to Vista out there, what happens to Vista? I mean,
well, let's talk about your experience. A year ago, you were out fully in the open source .NET development community. Now you're working in one of the teams at Microsoft that's at the heart of development and has produced open source code. Mm-hmm. Sort of, what have you seen practically that's shifted or that surprised you? Or
geez, a lot of things. Mostly how gracious everybody in the group is. I'm pretty much a troublemaker. That's kind of my job. I don't know if Phil Hack ever made it here or Elon Lipton, but if they're here, they'll stand up and agree to that. I cause trouble, and the fact that the culture accepts that, to me, it was exciting. Of course, we've had headaches, but the openness for which it was received, and what my job is, basically, is to take community feedback off the forums and put it right up front. And even as challenging as it can be, and there's a particular person in our community who's really challenging, and I got into a little bit of an online to-do with him, and I basically said, we're accepting resumes, so all your criticism can be taken internal. And he came back with a couple zingers, and I said, okay, fine, but are you going to send your resume? And he said, all right, well, I'm open to it. And so I was kind of giggling as I called up, one of the guys above my pay grade, and he said, I got this guy, what do you think? And he looked at me seriously, and he said, yeah, I think it's a good idea. And I was blown away. And I thought, wow, are you serious? And he said, yeah, I think he's got some good ideas. And I said, well, he's a really challenging person. I mean, really hard to deal with. And the guy he looked at me and he said, that's okay. We have room for that. And I was like, good Lordy. And, it's really encouraging. And I think the hardest part for me has been trying to communicate that kind of perception outward to people. Because, man, I meet people and they say, you're from Microsoft. You screw everything up, and then rah, 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 rah. And not all the time, but it's really, you want to put the smile on it and say, no, but really, we're really trying to make a big difference here. So anyway, that's kind of been my last few.
And for those who don't know exactly where Rob sits in the organization, he's in Scott Guthrie's organization, and that's really an org that has gotten so tuned into what developers want, really understanding the open source development desires, what drives adoption of technology. So I think they've really shown consistently a lot of leadership. I see Sean Burke here in the front seat, who's also a great leader in the internal open source community inside Microsoft.
Yeah. Sean did the ASP.NET control toolkit, and are you behind the Silverlight controls that were open source yesterday? Yeah. So. Yeah. So yeah, Scott is doing a lot of open sourcing. And I think it's because, and I have this theory, which is completely unproven. I have no data to back it up. But I'm sure...
Best kind of theory.
The what?
It's best kind.
Yeah, exactly. So my point, I'm sure that a lot of the openness that is coming from this group comes because Scott is a web guy. He did IIS and then he did ASP.NET. And I think he understands, open protocols and multiple implementations of the same thing. And that's the feeling that I get, but I don't know. I don't know how Microsoft works. Maybe he gets all the credit for someone else, but I get the feeling that appointing your ASP.NET genius to run the .NET team is one of the smartest moves.
He's a really reasonable guy. I mean, I can't think of any other GMs or corporate vice presidents who go to food camps and bar camps and surrounded by people using apples and say, everybody's using Ruby. What's going on? So,
he's also the most energetic guy I've ever seen.
Yeah.
The guy is starting at 2 a.m. in the morning doing a demo and leaving everybody impressed, and the next morning at 7 a.m. doing the same demo with someone else. I'm like, how does this guy do it?
So, any questions? There's other questions that we can certainly ask on the panel.
Well, so you're talking about the value of the open development cycle and how the things like the MVC framework and all that, you're seeing great results because it's an open process and all that. So I'm wondering, and you talked earlier about the kind of digital natives and the text or cell phone or all that. So how can that be driven to other places inside the Microsoft development? Like, I'm thinking about the IE8 development process where it's good, but the first we're hearing about it is beta 1, and it's kind of like, here's what we did. And so I'm wondering how that can be we'll see that elsewhere, or if that's possible.
So a number of us participate in basically the cultural change process, and I think a lot of it happens through people coming into the company with a web or an open source orientation, and a lot of it happens through the kinds of networks that we've had the privilege to build in the community, resulting in the people who are on this panel. Again, a couple of years ago, I don't think that we could have put together a panel like this. So the fact that we built those connections, and we really try to extend those. Miguel's met people across the company, Andy has as well, and as has Mike. We had breakfast with the person in charge of shipping Expression Web, right? So just creating those kinds of connections where the Expression Web team wants to support Firefox and PHP just as they do ASP.NET and IE. Just creating the personal connections is where openness can really take another surge, I think.
I think your example of IE8 and the process behind it is a really apropos one. Because if you pay attention to what exactly happened there, they blogged a month or two ago and said, hey, we're going to have this new rendering switch that's going to default to backwards compatible to IE7, and then if you change your doc type or do this thing, then you'll use the new super standards mode. And we did that in consultation with a whole bunch of experts, right? And then they published that in the blog, and they got immediate feedback from everyone in the world going, what are you doing? Like, you're breaking the web. Can you flip this around and basically go standards by default and have a fallback for sites that want to do an IE7 mode and can't update themselves? And to their credit, they reversed their decision, right? And they're now doing it, which is a fantastic thing for the web. But I think that's the point is, if they had done the process in the open from the beginning and actually said, we haven't made a decision, but we're trying to figure out A or B, what do people think, right? They would have gotten to that end decision the first time around and not had to flip it around. And so I think
but dollars to donuts, right? The learning, the process, and the cultural shift will show up in how IE9 gets shipped, and you wouldn't see a situation like that erupt the way that you talked about with increased community dialogue, right? So I want to impress on everyone that it's a journey, and that people are building cultural practices around this kind of stuff. So that things like that are a huge learning event, and it changes how we build software.
Right, and I think there are certain things that also companies do, like the new ribbon and in the new office. So when I saw it the first time, it shocked me.
Everybody jumps on the ribbon.
No, today I have to say that I actually personally feel it's much better than what we had in the past. It's much easier to use. You can get it functionality much faster. But those are kind of things. I think it's good to throw them out in the community, but sometimes companies also have to take risks. I mean, you throw it out, even if not everyone loves it. There are things that take, from an adoption point of view, it takes people a few months sometimes to get used to significant changes in how they're used to working. I can say today that after, probably took me 2-3 weeks. After 2-3 weeks, I suddenly felt the ribbon was much better. So I think as much open process as possible is good, and we do that at Zend, and we try and get feedback as early as possible. But at the end of the day, sometimes people just have to kind of go with their gut feeling and do what they think is best. But that is after they've heard the feedback, of course.
Yeah, Mike made a very similar comment in a panel he was on yesterday on how to design great products, and that there's a certain requirement for people to say, I really believe in this, and let features soak in. So it's an interesting tension that you're describing, right, between sort of mob-based design versus design-based design. So
it's interesting too. Jeff Atwood wrote a great post. I don't know if anybody knows who Jeff Atwood is, but he wrote a great article called "Us Where, Them Where," something like that. But the idea was looking externally and looking way outside. And what do people want? And to your point, the ability to look at that blog post or whatever and learn from it and say, oh dear, but to do that up front is critical. And I think voices that, like Phil's voice in our group is a big one. And same with Scott Hansel, and those guys come in and they shake it up and say, wait, don't name it that. Don't do it this way. Look at these blog posts, look at these things, and there's reaction in our group, which is, whoa, okay. And so it's a matter of cycling the process and getting the wind there. That's the big deal, and then it'll move forward.
We got a question.
First, does Phil work for Microsoft now, or
Phil Hack?
Yeah. Did he work for them last year?
No.
He got 6 months ago. Then I hired him. He works for me now.
Interesting. The assimilation factor.
Yeah,
it's a reverse takeover.
Yeah. Happened to my brother too, unfortunately. But to kind of circle around back to the opening statements, I wanted to get the whole panel's view and tell me if it's a broken view on my part as far as getting companies to embrace open source. Where usually if I have a team of people, I have to make a case. You say, we're going to use open source, and I'm going to have a team of programmers who are going to work on open source. And and like I said, I just want to know if this is a broken view or not when I go to the owner and say, we're going to basically take some stuff that we do that you're going to pay us to do, and we're going to post it back out to the world. Okay. And so one of the ways that I like to look at it, and it may be an old view, but where I'd say, hey, we're using non-open source tools. Let's say we're buying all our tools, buying all our operating systems, and take that money, X amount, and then basically say, well, whatever that X amount is, you're going to pay us to develop any open source project we want to do. And that is your way of actually paying for open source, is that you just say, well, you take 10% of how much what we do, and the programmers can pick whatever project they want or something that has to do with their work. And, but anyway, it's a good way for the business people to look at it. They say, hey, we're going to pay for open source. And is that like a broken view, or I always want everybody's comments on how to get any other business to do the same kind of thing.
Go ahead. No, I just want to say, I don't think open source is free, right? And I don't think, proprietary software is necessarily more expensive, than open source. So, I'll give you one example. I think, there are open source J2E, implementations, right? I don't think that building a web application on J2E is cheaper than building it on .NET, because I think on JT, developer productivity is very, very low. So I think, first of all, from a business point of view, you have to look kind of the bigger picture, how much it's going to cost you to, hire the right people, train them, how many servers are you going to need, and so on. What I do think, though, is that open source gives a business a lot of flexibility, and it depends what you're doing. But I was in a company where we will build projects that would have to last, 15 to 20 years. That's kind of the lifespan. So you're talking very, very large, long-term systems. We got stuck with proprietary software when for reasons of, we needed new hardware, needed new operating system. We couldn't move that software from, old hardware that wasn't supported anymore. And the lack of that flexibility was actually our biggest issue. So we made some pretty strategic decisions to go open source, not because of the, immediate cost issue, because there was actually there's almost literally no limitation on how much we could pay for software. But it was an issue of flexibility and allowing the business to control its own fate, if companies, disappear and so on and so forth. Or, Microsoft did with Visual Basic 6, right, where they pretty much end of life that, and you had to move over to .NET. So I think that's probably the most significant driver for companies, is to actually have more control of their infrastructure and the stack that they're building on top.
Okay, I totally understand that. What I mean, for you to comment, and I want everyone else to comment also, is that basically making a case to actually, yes, using open source, but actually having programmers develop stuff and add to the open source and post it back to the world. Yeah,
okay, so I think the business case there is, and I actually deal with a lot of customers that give back to the open source community. I think it's really a win-win for them, because what they're doing, very often they're building on top of some existing open source project, and by giving it back to the community, they have additional eyes that look on it, they have people fixing bugs, plus long term they don't have to maintain that code. So if they can improve the open source project, into the direction that they need, that is good for the open source community, it's good for customers. So I definitely encourage, unless it's something, intellectual property in your application and you want to keep it in-house, the more you're able to contribute back to open source, the better for you, because you save a lot of the long-term maintenance costs.
Anyone else?
I would say that, we tried building a fully open source company a few years ago, and we eventually were acquired by Novell, so I come actually from this startup. And it turns out that if you want to be a software development shop, not a support organization, but a software development shop, if you go with pure open source, there is no way you're going to survive. There's a couple of exceptions, like Mozilla gets basically paid through an ad network. But if you're not in that position, I think that it's very hard to have a company that's self-sustaining in a pure open source fashion. And there's a couple of exceptions, but they're incredibly hard. And if you talk to the people that have been successful there, it's been very hard for those people as well. My feeling is that you need to have what you need to do is to have a mixed strategy. So some pieces you will open source, And you basically use open source as a tool. It's like any other tool that you would use in a business. Maybe just like getting a loan from the bank is a tool, and you have to balance the pros and cons of getting a loan or a VC investment. You have to take into account the pros and cons of what you do. So you need to be able to take some open source software, so take software from the public, bring it into the company, and adopt it for your own purposes, and maybe contribute to that, and keep some chunks that are proprietary to you. And you have a mix of those things. Microsoft is, I think, at a stage where they don't take open source software, and I think that's damaged them because everybody else is doing it. So they're at a disadvantage there. But they're starting to produce code that, for some reason, is advantageous to them, right? So it's advantageous to get people the source code, make sure that they get the software, they can fix it, that's not a roadblock for the adoption of some of their products. So I think that you need to use it as a strategic tool, and you need to go on a case-by-case basis. What is a case? I mean, really, I mean, your job is on the line, and your paycheck is on the line. So you need to make a strategic decision. Sometimes going open source is the right thing, and sometimes keeping it proprietary is the right thing to do.
Yeah, it needs to be aligned with your business in terms of the strategies that we see people pursue. And there's sort of a range from, am I a user of open source? For example, I'm a financial services company, and we're talking about IT development. There are things that are going to be aligned with driving their business forward, and there are going to be things that will be off to the side. The legal costs for figuring out what you can contribute are going to be too high in some cases to just contribute to a lot of different projects. But you take a look at AMQP, which is an MQ series open source replacement. That could drive down the licensing costs for many Wall Street companies around their MQ series licensing. So there's a reason to participate and go through the challenge of reforming your process. So that's sort of a customer side sustainable model that we've seen. On the vendor side, in terms of a software vendor side sustainable model, there are obviously companies that provide services, right? You look at you look at a number of models like that. But when you're talking about software, as Miguel was talking about, when the kernel of your product is something that's an open source project, let's take Apache Access 2. It's a web services stack in the Apache Software Foundation, one of their key projects. There's a company called WSO2, which builds a commercial extension and set of manageability functionality on top of that. They continue to contribute to the free and open base and maintain their knowledge and sort of some degree of direction over where Access 2 goes. But then they're benefiting from being able to sell commercial and run some proprietary code over the top of that.
Okay, just one final last comment. Like Miguel, I appreciate your answer. In my personal case, actually, the past several companies I've worked for, we actually weren't a software company. For example, I work for a company that we use like the Sleepycat database, for example, and so we use it for a completely different product, but we contributed back to that project. And then another company, we did training stuff, and the company we're working right now, we're doing we do some back end communication with Authorize.net, things like that. And so we actually kind of contribute back that code, for example. And so just in my case, I guess I totally agree with you. If you're a software company selling software, that maybe a little problematic. But there's a lot of programmers out there that don't actually, software is not their end product, right? So, but
Yeah. And again, I think it goes back to the issue of the open data. I mean, the reason some of the data is not open is because that's your value, right? And you don't want to just put it out. And it's a business decision. I understand why some people want to keep it. I wish everything was open. I mean, it would be ideal. It would be very nice. But there are good business reasons why you want to keep it internally. And I think that the challenge is, if you want that data to be public or if you want the source to be public, I think that you need to articulate a good business reason why somebody should open source it or should open the data up.
I think the key point here, though, is this point of leverage and maintainability, right? Is that if you use open source and keep a set of patches in your own tree that is for your own product, like over time it's going to drift, and that's now code that you solely are responsible for maintaining. I mean, how many people here have been at a company that produced a great product where all the code died behind the firewall when the company went away? Or had to work on a project that was 10 years old, that 10 years ago was state of the art, but it's completely fallen behind the curve, and now you're like trying to port this old VB or COBOL app, and you're just total disaster, right? So if you can get the core parts, especially when you're talking about infrastructure like databases, web servers, browsers, operating systems, all of the core components where you're not solving problems that are unique to you, right? That you may be using them in a unique way, but they're similar problems to lots of other people. If you can get that into an open source project, then the world gets the shared leverage of being able to reuse this, knowledge and technology and build new things on top of it more quickly. So I think that in the long-term maintenance costs, you can save dramatically in terms of what you have to deal with in-house by using open source and contributing back.
I agree, but that happens if you have an active community with an active maintainership. I think that if you have that code, if you have COBOL code, or let's take an HR application, I just don't see anyone that I know saying, oh, wow, HR software, I'm going to go improve the review process and I'm going to add some Ajax controls.
Please?
Yeah, well, everybody says please.
Would somebody do it?
Yeah, I would like one, but, but it's like, it works, it gets the job done, so you're just going to have the 10 minutes that the thing is going to take to refresh the page.
Right, but that's the difference between source code available and open source.
No, but even if it was
really
open source, like
distinction.
an HR app, I just don't see a hacker saying, Jesus, I really want to improve the pipeline of the HR process.
Yeah, you have to be realistic about your community.
Yeah. If it's Mozilla, you're like, oh yeah, I'm in, baby. But if it's an HR app,
yeah, but there are examples. So Sugar CRM, right? Customer relation, is CRM more sexy than an HR app? I don't know, but there are people who work on it. So and what's that? Sorry, it has sugar in the name, so it must be good, right? So, but I think you're right in the sense that just barfing out source code doesn't make an open source project, right?
I think you need to maintain it.
It worked for me.
Made the whole trip worth it.
Yeah, well, Rob mentioned.
You got that on tape, right? Great.
Yeah, exactly. Rob Mensching, who's the maintainer for Windows Installer XML Toolkit at Microsoft, which is one of our most popular open source projects, he says source code is an inanimate object. It's probably the most articulate statement of there's a difference between source availability and open source, and you can't barf it out. I think I'm going to use that in the future.
Yes,
that doesn't make it open source.
It's a technical term, so be careful how you use it. But but I think that the community is a really important part, and I think that's where we missed the one part of open in the very beginning, which is open participation, right? So publishing my source code and not allowing anyone to contribute back, or me being the only one who can review it, right? And there's no way for anyone in the community to start to participate, right? Is a failed open source project, right? That the most successful open source projects had people who came out of nowhere, who through their contributions in the project started to get credibility and then got capability to make decisions in those projects. And that is actually harder than open sourcing the code, right? Because you're now not only open sourcing the code, to some degree you're relinquishing control a little bit, right, to an unknown set of people you may never meet in person, right, or not know where they live. And so that's a hard thing and takes some time to get going. If you can get it going, though, it pays off, double dividends in the long run. And or if it's an easier problem where you're using Sleepy Cat or you're using something else and you made a minor patch that you think actually is applicable to other people, getting that into the project where there's already a project out there, something you really, really want to do. Because otherwise it's your deal to maintain that. And they will break you, right? If the code is in their tree, then no one can check in other code that will break that patch now. If they can't see it, they'll break it accidentally sometime. It's just a question of whether it's tomorrow or next month.
So open participation is important, but also popularity is important, right? If you're in the top, 200, 500 SourceForge projects, you're probably making a reasonably well-balanced, well-balanced risk assessment to go and adopt that. But there's nothing in place beyond that to say that you're going to take a technology that's not going to end up being defunct in a couple of years, just as is the case with commercial software. You can say that the company that went out of business that had proprietary software, they lost the popularity contest. Nobody wanted to buy their software anymore. The same thing happens with contribution in open source projects. So it's not a silver bullet. It's a new model, and I think one of the challenges in the community that need to be solved is a really good, consistent risk assessment framework to say, is this a pretty popular one? What kind of check-ins? What level of openness? So that you can make really smart decisions about what you adopt.
Well, there is a really good resonance between a market force and open source. If you want something to take off really quick, and you have a good idea that the market likes, and you open source it, you're going to have people contribute right now, and then spiral it out. And it's going to be great. If it sucks, it's going to die really fast. So there's a lot there.
But there's also a cultural, I find a cultural problem. In Mono, we get two kinds of users. We get the Windows crowd that takes code from Mono and sticks it in the compact framework, because compact framework doesn't have everything, right? And those guys tend to take and they send us email saying, hey, this doesn't work. And I was like, well, but where's the patch? We fixed it. And it's like, well, great, but in the patch? Right. So there's a culture of, at least in my opinion, the Windows crowd is not, is not in line with, I find a bug, I report it, or I find a bug, I'll send you the patch, or I'll contribute. And on the other hand, the Linux community is like, hey, I find the bug, here's a patch, here's a test suite, here's the bug number, and here's how you apply it, right? So there's a big cultural problem there. When we deal with the Windows community, it's always like, well, send me a patch, and they send you the whole file. It's like, dude, send me a diff. And so.
The response I get is, what's a patch?
Well, there's, yes,
Actually,
exactly.
it's after they say your software sucks. I'm like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Give me a patch. What's a patch?
Yeah. So I think you need to have a community. I mean, we need to educate the Windows crowd that they need to start sending patches. Yeah.
So we're in the last 5 minutes, so I'll just ask each of you to take a minute or so to give your take on where is open at today? How much more open are we as an industry? Or if you want to make an assessment about Microsoft, you're welcome to do so as well, than we were a year ago.
Oh, that's a trick question.
No, not at all. Not intended.
I can start. I mean, I think Microsoft has made huge progress in the past, year or two, and I think, all of us still, keep on complaining, and there's obviously more that we want to see. But I think if you look at Microsoft 3-4 years ago and where we are today, it's a huge difference. I mean, the fact that we've worked together on making PHP run well on the Windows platform. We're talking about opening the protocols and the file formats, and even if some of that comes from due to legislation, I think eventually, and what Microsoft is seeing is Microsoft is seeing the value. They're seeing the value. They're seeing the community uptake. So the direction is very, very positive. And we've done a lot. We're doing other work with Microsoft, like SQL Server connectivity for PHPs. And you mentioned that Expression Web is going to be supporting PHP, in Expression Web, not only ASP. So what you're seeing is we started, I think, 1.5 years, 2 years ago, just by talking about how do we make PHP run well on Windows, and it's expanding throughout Microsoft now. We're seeing a lot of the other product teams, pick up on that, or they're very enthusiastic, about working with PHP. And so it's a whole level of openness, I think, that's really going throughout Microsoft. So, I definitely like to commend, Sam and the rest of the team at Microsoft that has really managed to move this forward. And, I'm sure in the next few years there's going to be more progress. And even if some of the progress is progress that Microsoft doesn't want to do today, I think as they see the value and as they see that they actually, their business is succeeding more rather than less, you're going to see even more openness.
Thank you, Andy. I appreciate that.
For me, what I hope to see, in a way I liken it to trying to get back together with your girlfriend. I mean, warring for so long and the rhetoric that goes back and forth, and then you slowly start having dialogue and whatnot. I'm not going to touch that. I stick my foot in my mouth, but not like that. Anyway,
abandoned metaphor.
Yeah, that's what I did. My boss is sitting right here. Sorry, Sean. Anyway, no. But to have the dialogue open up again, and the fact that we're sitting at this panel and Mike hasn't punched me out yet, I think it's a good thing. We're all talking to each other, and I hope to see it go forward where the rhetoric dies on both sides. I walked into a designer's office the other day to say hello. I'm from Microsoft, and the guy almost kicked me out. And then after a while, we started talking, and it's like, I'm not evil. And at the same time, I don't think he's a long-haired hippie freak. So, but it's on both sides, right? So I'm hoping that the dialogue moves forward in a positive way. I speak my mind.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, sure. No problem.
So Mike or Miguel, who's going to bet cleanup?
I'll let Miguel have the last word since I had the first word. So, and since he makes me feel better about my barfing comment.
Make you feel better about barfing.
I think that the industry has come a long way. I think Microsoft has definitely made some progress. I think a lot of that is to Sam and other folks personal credit in terms of opening things up. And I think the game isn't over yet. We have a lot more to go. And I think, as a lot of people said, there's no magic here. There's a lot of hard work. And I think keeping focused on the why behind the what and what the benefits are to end users, to consumers, to the company themselves, to the marketplace, I think is what keeps me focused on what's important. Because it's not about a particular end state. It's about building better products for real people, keeping people safe, building a competitive marketplace where the best products, the best companies win, right? So that's why I said before, I think it takes courage to compete in open source, because you have to believe that you're actually better than other people, that your teams are better, that your products are better, and so you can win on the merits. And I think that's true for a lot of companies today who are closed, who are actually very good, but they're nervous about taking that step. And it's an unnerving and difficult thing, but I think that it results in better products, better companies, better competition, and better productivity in the world. So although I get accused of being a communist a lot, I'm actually really a capitalist at heart, and I think that the fun competition and building great products is what gets me up in the morning. And I think this is, this evolution is one way to make it better and more competitive and build great stuff for real people. So,
thanks, Mike. Miguel?
Oh God,
The
this is
spotlight is
so
on you, my friend.
complicated. So complicated. A few years ago, I read this book that I was really embarrassed I was reading, and I kept it a secret. And so I wrote the book, and I'm not going to tell you what book it was, but I read The Secret. I was like, I'm not going to tell anyone this stuff because everybody's going to make fun of me. And then my best friend, Nat Friedman, I told him, dude, I read this book. It's really good. And it's like, oh yeah, I read that book every year. I mean, it's a rule. I read it every year. It's awesome. It's fantastic. And so I should tell you, it's how to make friends and influence people. And I was really embarrassed of telling that to my friends. But there's a couple of things that I learned in that book, and the first one is you attract more people with honey than with vinegar. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense. I was like, yeah, why the fuck haven't I been doing that? And I think it has to do with and it changes your perspective from we should bash Microsoft because Microsoft, the evil empire. Yada, 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 rhetoric. And instead, you start talking to the people and you go to the ECMA meetings and you become good friends. And I got to shut up in 2 minutes.
You're doing great.
And you start making friends. And it turns out that if you're nice to people, they'll be nice to you. And I think that collaboration in these areas started more at the grassroots level, with Jim Miller and Anders Helsberg and all of those guys. And kind of has been bubbling up over the years. So it hasn't been it wasn't immediate, but I think that helped. And I think that Microsoft is also, I think that Microsoft can learn a lot from that, and Microsoft could do some of things like that. And, every time that people say, well, you can't trust Microsoft because they're evil. In particular, I'm involved in this OpenOffice XML thing, which I think is a good thing. And everybody in open source thinks that it's, it's apocalypse. And I think it's ridiculous. Microsoft is doing something genuinely useful. I wrote a spreadsheet many years ago. I think it's the best spreadsheet out there called Numeric. So I care about the issue of file formats and spreadsheets and so on. And I think it's a very good thing. And, Microsoft gets a lot of bad credit for that. But, we should give them the benefit of the doubt. And the other book that I kind of loved, and it's also one of those embarrassing things, is from a director of the Boston Philharmonic called The Art of Possibility, right? And he's this very energetic guy that tells you can live in a world where everything is broken, everything sucks, you're never going to fix it. And you live in this world where you're constantly worried and you're constantly fearful of the future. And basically, this guy and his wife go around giving you kind of a message of hope. It's like, well, what do you think about what are the options? You're here now. Where do you want to go, right? And look at the options, look at the positive things, and So Microsoft might not be perfect, and I might disagree on the patent situation, but I think that working with Sam has been a privilege, and Scott Guthrie, and So, it's not where I would like it to be. I would like to go from here to here, but, if I keep whining and complaining and, I'm a victim and you start, lashing out, you're not going to get anywhere. So anyways, Art of Possibility, fantastic book, and Dale Carnegie's How to Make Friends and Influence People.
Great. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel.